Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Crouch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 26 of the 50 most relevant. We are at the halfway marker of the countdown of the players I believe are the most relevant to have a conversation and a dissection look out for your AFL Fantasy, SuperCoach and Dream Team sides for 2025. Have we hit on a player that you were bullish on yet? Are there a few surprises that have caught you off guard? What does the back half of the countdown hold for us? It'll all be revealed over the next few weeks. Joining me on this episode, the man that kicked off the 50 most relevant with us, and you'll continue to hear right throughout this series. It's Coaches Panel member, MiniMonk. Hello, mate. How are you? We are talking about Jack Sinclair today, probably one of the most reliable, durable, consistent premium defenders of the past 3 years. And, well, many people think it'll just be play on and make it 4 years in a row.
Let's hope so. You know, I think the back half of this countdown might be as good as the back half of his 2024 season. And if that's the case, this countdown's going to finish strong.
Oh, he finished strong last year. We'll talk about that. He is a defender mid for us in 2025. There was some fear that maybe he'd lose defensive status, but when you look at the season in totality, that would have been daylight robbery to deny him of defensive status. He comes in at an AFL Fantasy average of a 101.9, and because of that in Fantasy and Dream Team, you're spending 7 figures to own this man. He's $1 million man. While in SuperCoach, a 109.9 seasonal average means he's at $592,200. A career-high AFL Fantasy score last year against North Melbourne. It was a 156, while in SuperCoach, his highest score last year was against the Gold Coast Suns, a 147. Well, you just go back the year prior to a career-high score in SuperCoach, a 160 against the Giants. So has he got some ceiling? Yeah, when Jack Sinclair gets going, when that scoring from transition and that handball receive and run and carry game of the Saints gets moving, Jack finds a way to pick up the scoring. Minnie, last year was just another solid year from Jack Sinclair, and solid sounds bad, but he's dominating in so many different key scoring criteria for us. Per game, he's 7th in the league for kicks. He's top 14 for effective disposals. He's top 20 in the league per game for disposals in total. Such a high scoring from transition player as well, but does have a stoppage game about him too, which means you throw those elements in, you throw a couple of kick-ins, a decent clearance win rate, all these elements. He's just a brilliant starting upgrade option. It's why for 3 years we've just wanted and have had Jack Sinclair in our fantasy sides.
He's got a lot of pathways to being able to score, you know. You look for those players that can get both CBAs and kick-ins, and he's probably one of maybe half a dozen in the competition that can get both on a regular basis. You know, 5 games with more than 50% CBAs and another couple with 48% CBAs during the 2024 season. And almost every single game that he played in the season, he had at least a kick-in. There were only 3 where he didn't, and they were games that he did get a bit more midfield rotation, and they had to throw the magnets a bit because of who was playing and who was missing. But the fact that he can do, 5 kick-ins one week and then 70% CBAs the week after allows him to have a pathway to being able to score. And that's one of the biggest things that you need to look for when you are going for these premium guys. Have they got the pedigree? Have they got the pathway to scoring? And what's changing for them for the 2025 season? And when we come to St Kilda, there are a couple of changes. We've had personal changes in the back line. We've had personal changes in the midfield. And we have a purported shift of players that are actually still in that squad, moving into a different position and trialing that out. Now, all of these allow for a shift in what we might expect from Jack Sinclair in 2025. There's pros, there's cons. But on the balance, it leads to a very interesting conversation about him.
Yeah, he's fascinating. Like, before we unpack those variables, just to look at what he did last year and the few seasons prior in a little bit more granular detail. Of those 101.9 average in fantasy last year, that's 13 tons. Just the 4 scores under 80. A lot of them came at the start of the year too, when he was coming back off a calf injury. That was the reason he missed round 1. Not as big of a ceiling as you might hope in fantasy, but it's still there with 3 scores, 120 plus. And he's 8th across all defenders for us that are available this year for both average and for points. You flip over into SuperCoach, a 109.9 average, 13 tons, a slightly higher conversion rate of hundreds to 120s. 8 are over 120, 6 are over 130. And he had 4 games last year where he scored between 140 and 147. And to go alongside that, despite that slightly slower start that we noticed in AFL Fantasy, he only had 2 games in SuperCoach all year that he goes below 80. 7th across defenders for us with defender for points and average. And you throw the last couple of years on top of that as well. Like, he's basically a 102 guy the 2 seasons prior in fantasy. And then he was a 106.7 and a 113.7 in SuperCoach. You throw in the fact that he's just missed 1 game over 3 years, has just been Mr. 102 in AFL Fantasy and nothing under 106 in SuperCoach. It is just predictable, consistent, safe, free to breathe. And whilst these are not terminologies we like to use in our starting squads, upside has to be the term we use. I am being slightly tongue-in-cheek when I say that. But if you were to ever build around a premium defender that felt low risk, with high scoring capacity, with a good scoring floor, and with not too many challenges, it's no doubt to me, Mini, why so much of the community are going, I don't know who to get at D1. I've got some excess cash. Stuff it. I'll go Sinclair because he feels, quote unquote, the safest of all our premium defenders this year.
What we need in starting squads quite often is a bit of balance. You don't want to be going too many safe picks, and you don't want to be going too many picks where you're chasing 10, 15, 20 points worth of upside. And what Jack Sinclair brings is a lot of safety. We talk about those first 5 weeks where he was coming back off of a calf concern in round 1. 4 of those games, he had relatively poorer games. And that can be explained away by the fact that he had that calf concern and that they were easing him into those games. 79, 99, 105, 74, 64 AF, and 78, 89, 124, 89, 73 SuperCoach. After those 5 games, it's relatively smooth sailing from there. There's just the one really poor game in round 9, but you're going to get a blip like that from any sort of premium defender, let alone even premium midfielders. What Jack Sinclair can provide is an anchor to build your defensive line around. You say, I'm going to lock this guy in as my D1 come round 1. He is going to be a top 6 defender for the entirety of the season because he's got that consistency. He's done it for the last 3 years, and I don't have to worry about trading him in during the season. It's another headache that I'm saving myself. It's not the most sexy pick. It's not the person that's going to win you the competition, but it minimizes the amount of other decisions that you have to make in an already very difficult preseason for our defensive line.
If you're taking a high element of risk in other positional spaces in your team, whether that be positional risk or an injury risk, we've already gone through a number of these players through the 50 most relevant. If that risk profile keeps stacking up, the upside is absolutely huge if they all pay off. But the law of averages would probably say you're going to have a couple of these go pear-shaped. And so what Minnie's talking about is, should you choose to have a heavy risk profile in other portions of your side, there's this beautiful, perceived stable option in a Jack Sinclair, which is why so many people with this plethora of cash left over after extracting all the value and upside, we find a pretty easy, justifiable reason to jump there. But you mentioned at the top of this episode, Minnie, that there's a couple of dynamic changes afoot for St Kilda. And what we've seen with Jack Sinclair is he's able to score well across that halfback, take a split of kick-ins. He's not the Lions' share. That's an Isaiah Wanganeen Miller. If you want to check out my thoughts and VAMs, the Fantasy Nut chat, you could go back and check that through this series. Wherever you're listening to this episode or watching it, you can go and check that out there. We talked a bit about Isaiah, but he's just as prominent a scorer off half-back as he is through centre bounce. There's a little bit of margin of upside and downside, but you could put that down to fixtures, matchups who they're against, whether it's raining at a ground. It's not like it's a 30-point per game differential in that regard. Talk to me how you see this St Kilda side going to look, because that midfield mix looks unique and interesting to me. But then there's also some conversations around who does distribute the ball off halfback, with no Bonner, some experiments in intra-club matches with Nasiah Wanganeen-Miller pushing up to wings and half forward. How do you see this side shaking up through the halfbacks and the midfield? Because Sinclair feels to me like the kind of guy that whatever is the need to fill a gap, he might be the guy that gets plugged in there.
Yeah, absolutely. But we want to start with the conversation about what is his scoring when he's off halfback compared to in the midfield. And if you look at the numbers, he has poor games when he's playing off halfback, and he plays good games when he's playing off halfback. He has poor games when he's a CBA midfielder, and he has good games when he's a CBA midfielder. I think regardless of which role he gets, he will still average out to being a good enough scorer for us to consider. The personnel changes in terms of the midfield. They've lost Brad Crouch for the entirety of the season. He's gone in 2024. He will not be there in 2025. Just the one game for him, though, in the 2024 season. They've also got Paddy Dow still there. They've got Marcus Windhager still there. Hunter Clark still there, but Seb Ross is gone. That's another 40% of CBAs, especially early on in the season. But they brought Jack McRae in. So when you look at the personnel they have, you're probably thinking Steele, McRae, Windhager, Philippou, Sinclair. Yep. I'd say that's about the 5 midfielders that they want to run, and they probably want to run Steele and McRae at the majority of them. I don't see either of them getting less than about 80% CBAs per game. They've brought McRae in for a reason, and then the other 3 will get smatterings of CBAs. So Sinclair might get a game where he gets 60, 70%, and he might get games when he gets 0%. They'll probably just play it depending on what happens to personnel through the year. I think the more interesting one, though, is what's happening off that half-back line. They have gone out and drafted Travaglia to try and figure out another distributor of half-back. They've lost Bonner, and they're experimenting with Nasiah Wanganeen-Miller. Now, if we look at this kick-ins percentage and the number of kick-ins, Nasiah had 91 kick-ins last year of a total of 234 seconds. Bonner had 52. Sinclair only had the 65. So in between the two, but it's about 28% of the total CBAs, whereas Nasiah is closer to that 40 to 45% marker. Almost every kick-in that Sinclair has, he takes off and plays on with. Now, let's say that with Bonner being out, and Nasiah being moved around a little bit, let's say that someone like Travaglia or Sean Makers comes in and they take another 10 to 15% of those kick-ins off of what Bonner and Nasiah had. Let's give Sinclair 40% of those kick-ins. And let's say that he plays on at roughly the same rate, about that 95% rate. That bumps the number of kick-ins that he gets from 65 to 88. That's an extra kick-in per game, basically. It's an extra 3 points per game in AFL Fantasy. It's about an extra 5 points per game in SuperCoach. If that's all that changes for him in 2025, and that might be all that changes for him in 2025, that's that little bit of upside that you need from a top 6 type player to say, you know what? This might be just what swings it. It's a safe pick. He's someone that I'm comfortable starting. There's a little bit of change in the midfield. There's a little bit of change down back. I think he can pick up an extra kick in per game. I'm considering starting him just because of that.
And I think if that feels like it's the pathway that could see an ease of scoring increase, more so than put him in a centre bounce and have to compete with, a reasonable high accumulator of a Jack McRae, who again scores more through transition than stoppage, but it's when he's around the ball at stoppage that he actually does his scoring from transition elements. A McRae who we know is the inside bull, to try to bump up his scoring from the inside with the addition of McRae feels hard to me, but even just the injection of a kick in or two here and there and a little bit of share, regardless of this experiment of Nasiah, half forward wing, happens in game or not. We know that intra-club and trial games internally is literally the club looking at stuff to see whether they can pull the trigger during the season, because it's better to experiment when you're taking on yourself and playing for nothing as opposed to playing for premiership points. So I'm not too concerned that we're going to see Nasiah there, but I'm intrigued to see what that does, because I think if anyone's going to bring that ball inside forward 50, of anyone on the St Kilda list, you'd probably say I'd love Wanganeen Miller being the one delivering the ball by foot almost over anybody else. I'm curious on your thoughts. In AFL Fantasy, SuperCoach, it's a different interaction. In AFL Fantasy, I understand why we want to pick him in our starting squad. No early buy, 3 years of consistent scoring. Don't love any of the other options because either bad injury history previously or some role concern. And while there could be a world where Sinclair is a 5% centre bounce increase or decrease, like we think we know what he's going to be. He does seem to lack ceiling. Like over his last 68 games in AFL Fantasy, he's only got 10 scores of 120 plus. Does that alarm you as somebody that, say you're running that ideology of, I just need a bulletproof, safe D1 that I can build around. I know he's going to be around the mark. Does that lack of scoring ceiling alarm you? Now, he's got it. He's got 140s. He can do it. But it's not all that regular when you contrast it to a Zorko, a Whitfield, a Sheasel, even a Sicily. These Stewart, like we could go through dozens more names, couldn't we? But does that concern you in a starting squad selection, or is that not the reason you're going near Sinclair?
This episode is brought to you by Love Hurts. Kiwi Kwan has had quite a career, from childhood roles in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and The Goonies to a recent Academy Award win for Everything Everywhere All at Once. But now Ki finally stars as a leading man in the film Love Hurts. Love Hurts is the perfect date night movie with its mix of over-the-top action, comedy, and a ton of heart. Love Hurts, only at theaters February 7th.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
I think it concerns you a little bit, but you've also got to contrast not just the ceiling, but then the floor. You know, you look at those names that you listed out, someone like a Whitfield, someone like a Zorko, someone like a Sheasel, someone like a Stewart. People have memories burned in of them scoring 40s, 50s, 60s, getting injured early in a game, having bad tags go onto them. You don't have those sorts of feelings associated with Jack Sinclair nearly as much because he's a much more consistent scorer. Yes, there's not that consistency of 120 plus type scores, but there's also not a consistency of lower than 80 scores. He has a floor where if he only drops 100k in AFL Fantasy and 60k in SuperCoach on his starting price, you wouldn't be shocked. So even if you are, you know, getting an 80, 85 score in round 1 or round 2, you just know that he's going to come back with a good score the week after at some point, and his price really isn't going to tank that far. The concern comes with, are you needing a captaincy type player? It's a bit confusing nowadays because the salary, the magic number keeps increasing in AFL Fantasy, and then there's been a tweak with it in SuperCoach with them bringing in the flex position. But if you're starting a player at over $1 million in AFL Fantasy, you typically want to be looking at them as a player that you can look to vice captain or captain. And then it comes to fixtures. So you go, right, where do they start off with? They've got Adelaide, which isn't amazing. But then the next 2 games, they've got under the roof against Geelong and against Richmond. Yes, they are at awkward times for doing captaincy. You know, he's a vice captainable option in round 2 with the Saturday night game and in round 3 with the Saturday afternoon game. It's definitely someone you could consider as a VC shout. Round 4, Port Adelaide. In Adelaide, probably not great. Round 5, GWS at Norwood, probably not great. Round 6, the Dogs at Marvel.
Well, at Marvel.
7:20 on the Sunday. You could bring it home with a captaincy option. So if you're saying, if captaincy is the concern when you're starting to get to that $1 million mark, I'd say 3 out of 6 weeks, he has the potential to be vice captain or captain. And he's got a consistency of floor where, yes, the ceiling isn't as there, but he won't hurt you because the floor is there.
Yeah, it's true. Marvel Stadium provides a lot of benefits for St Kilda players and anyone that plays there that sits into this sort of game style of high ball retention, lots of kicks, lots of marks, heavy possession game style, which Ross Lyon has done now for all three AFL teams and two clubs that he's coached. It's always been a high ball retention, high possession game style. And so one of the attractions around a Jack Sinclair has been over the last couple of years, they've ended the season with stretches of 4, 5, 6 games at Marvel Stadium. And so at that peak time off the bye where you're like, I need something that can fly, all the world to feel like they've converged for Jack Sinclair to absolutely dominate. But they don't really have a big run of games at Marvel this year. There's no 5-6 week stretch. It's a bit more layered and scattered across the year. There's still, a 2-week here, a 3-week there, a 1 game there. But there's no, we never leave this stadium for a month plus. Because I've looked over his last 2 years, and I'm intrigued what your thoughts are on this, MiniMonk, of his scoring at Marvel Stadium out as opposed to everywhere else. Last year, when he was at Marvel, he averaged 112.7 in fantasy and a 115.9 in SuperCoach. In 2023, for sake of reference to, he goes at an AFL fantasy average of a 105 and a 110.7 in SuperCoach. But when he's away from there is a bit of scoring regression. It's an 87.7 last year in fantasy, and in 2023, it's a 97.9, so not exactly disastrous, slightly alarming for you. Again, fixtures that come at different times, I'm aware. And then in SuperCoach, a 99.7 in 2024 away from Marvel and 100.9 in SuperCoach. Are those elements, given the fact that you've said rounds 2, rounds 3, and round 6 are their only Marvel Stadium games to start the year? Does that lack of ceiling, lack of Marvel consistency alarm you? Or again, is it just kind of like, no, we're reading too deep into numbers that don't really need to be worried about?
It's also round 2. So they've got round 2,
That's
round
true.
3, and round 6 at Marvel. It's not quite like we've seen it in previous seasons where in the back half of the season, they have 8 or 9 out of the last 11 games at Marvel. Yeah. It's a lot more smattered through the year. And that might be why in previous seasons we've seen he starts slow, come the back half of the season, he accelerates. Maybe this is another reason why you start him and say if they're all spread through the year, it might be worthwhile considering through the year because then you just get those spike scores when he's playing at Marvel, and when he's not playing at Marvel, you just know that it's going to be a little bit lower. But I think you've also got to look at who they play at Marvel as much as, the fact that they do play at Marvel.
Yeah.
A team that they quite often will play at Marvel and allow them to score well is the Western Bulldogs. They are a historically good team for halfbackers to score well against. Richmond, they tend to play there a lot more as well. Geelong sometimes as well. It's as much about opposition and about game style as it is about the stadium that they're playing at. So it's something to consider for sure. But I'm not sure I'd make it the be-all and end-all. But if we talk about opposition as well, the Western Bulldogs, friendly team to play against, he plays against them twice. Both games are at Marvel Stadium. He plays against Richmond at Marvel Stadium. He plays against North Melbourne at Marvel Stadium. He plays against Richmond again at the MCG, which is also a stadium where he can rack up. In fact, the top 4 teams for designated kickers to score against, which I'm going to put him into because I think that's the easier pathway for his scoring and the more likely pathway that I see at this point in time, are Gold Coast, Western Bulldogs, Collingwood and Richmond. And almost all of them, he plays them at Marvel Stadium. That is a pathway to being able to have big ceiling type, captainable games, consistent scoring. It's just very easy to see a pathway where he is able to at least maintain what his scoring has been for the last 3 years.
With no early buys, with some favourable early matchups against teams and at locations, there's an absolute clear, undeniable pathway for why you can justify starting Jack Sinclair. He could absolutely not just come out of the gate like his averages, but maybe with a little bit of upside, Mini.
There's also the round 13 bye, which he only shares with Fremantle. And, we've looked at defenders. If you're looking at Fremantle defenders or St Kilda defenders, there's only really 4 that are in consideration of being in that premium category.
Yeah.
We've talked about 2 of them already before today. And we've got one of them on today. You've got Clark, you've got Ryan from Freo, and you've got Sinclair and Nazai Wanganeen Miller from St Kilda. You're probably not going to have another defender on that bye. So why not consider someone who's going to be on that bye by themselves? We might have some freer players in our midfields. A lot of people are considering McRae as part of the forward line. But aside from, the usual suspects in Steele, Brayshaw, Young, Sarong, I don't see, and Marshall as well, there's not that much in terms of players taking up space in our starting squads and potentially in our squads by round 13. I'd say that's another really big positive considering someone like Sinclair.
If you're looking for someone in your starting squad that you just feel safe around, that has shown you year upon year upon year, they're durable, they've got some scoring ceiling, they've got a good scoring floor that's not too disastrous for you, that you can anchor your team build around, that allows you to take a slightly greater element of risk at D1 in other positions of your side. And then you start to look at the fixture, some matchups, let alone a percentage split of kick-ins that could come his way with the absence of a Bonner, with the uncertainty of whether Travalia or Schoenmaker take that other distribution spot, or Nasiah Wanganeen-Miller pushes up gradually higher. There is a pathway and a world that is conceivable and clear for why you should look at Jack Sinclair as your D1 to start 2025. Equally, you look over those last 3 years and you see a guy that's consistent, reliable, that there's some 120 plus scores through there, but in AFL Fantasy, they're rare, and in SuperCoach, they're not chaotic. They're big, but they're not chaotic 180s. There's a world where you look at him and go, well, just based on the magic number, I'll back against him not going 120 over the first 3 weeks, and I reckon I might get $50,000 off his price point, and I can get the most consistent, reliable defensive premium of the last 3 years. I can get him just a little bit cheaper and can get some upside in some other spots. Both thought ideologies are relevant, have a perception of accuracy, and that's what makes Jack the perfect guy to put in the middle of the 50 most relevant. Because if you're not starting him, you're 100% targeting him as an upgrade. And if you're not upgrading to him and you haven't started him, you're probably thinking he's got injured, which is historically not what's been the case over the last 3 years. But on draft day, MiniMonk, we choose here at the Coaches Panel to draft on the Keeper platform, whether it's for a single season, a dynasty, or a Keeper league. It has unrivaled customization, and if you're not on draft platforms and you're not on Keeper, you're just missing out. We think it's absolutely outstanding. He's a D1. He's a tier 1 defender.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see where he sits in that tiering, because I would suggest across the formats, most leagues would take Sheasel and Whitfield ahead of him. I think that would be pretty normative approach. But then he might get ahead of a player like Adane Zorko, who has a perception of injury, which didn't happen last year, but has a perception of poor injury history. Maybe not the ceiling of Sinclair, but we go there. Which number defender do you think he is off the board? Is it clear that he's no earlier than third off the board? Or could you see a world someone gets him as the first or second defender in their draft?
We look at him in AFL Fantasy as the 8th ranked defender by average, and I think you said he was the 4th ranked defender in SuperCoach. And you look at some of the names above him, yes, people will be drawn to the likes of Sheasel and Whitfield. Zorko, there's concerns about Flanders, there's concerns about Martin, there's concerns about Newman's unfortunately done his patella. Ryan, there's concerns about. And then the one who's ranked just beneath him is Nasiah Wanganeen-Miller. I think that there's a world where he is coming into people's draft boards as the 3rd or 4th ranked defender across the board. I think you're absolutely right. He's definitely a D1. I can see a world where some coaches consider taking him above the likes of a Sheasel, or above the likes of a Zorko, or above the likes of Whitfield. I think he'll probably go as about the D3 off the board across the formats. Where that is on the draft board as well, I think it's probably on the turn into the second round or an early second round pick. I don't think I'd be comfortable taking him in the first round, but I think if I was in the middle of the second round and he was coming back to me and I'd locked away, one of the big ruckmen or one of the big midfielders, I would be very, very comfortable just taking and locking away Jack Sinclair.
Yeah, if you're hoping, if you're at the back of the first round and you're doing a snake draft, for example, and you're hoping he gets back to you at the back of the third round, you are way stretching. You might get lucky at the early third round, but yeah, if you're sitting on the turn of the first and the second going, I'll get a primo mid, I'll get myself a ruck, and then I reckon Sinclair might get back to me. Look, anything can happen on draft day, but I think you're stacking the variables very much against you. So if you do want Sinclair, second round feels the normative timeline, with maybe the odd draft of seeing him into the early portions of the third, but not much beyond that. Hey, Mini, as always, an absolute pleasure talking about another player in the 50 most relevant. We'll have you back on again, I'm sure, multiple times before this series wraps itself up.
Glad to hear that. You're 25 down. You've got 25 left to go.
No one's happier than my wife, that is for sure. If you want to go and check out any of the other episodes on this series, the good news, you can, wherever you're checking out this episode. The others are already there as well. If you're watching this on YouTube, comment below. Let me know, what do you think Jack Sinclair is going to do in 2025? And what do you expect him to average? If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed, friend, come on now. It's a click of a button. It takes you a second, and it makes a huge difference for us here at the Coaches Panel. So too, if you're listening to this as an audio podcast, giving us a 5-star rating, subscribing to the channel so that as soon as an episode drops, you get notified on your device. You can listen to it. You can go for a run. You can go for a ride. Whatever you want to do, you can listen to the 50 most relevant. Inside the description of this episode are all the details to become part of our Patreon. Keep in touch with us across social media, and also become part of an exclusive membership club that owns their own Coaches Panel merch. If you want to look good for the 2025 season, we got you covered. Hoodies, hats, caps, tops, the works. It's all in there, and a few new additions coming to the store over the next couple of weeks as well. So, halfway through the countdown, feels like an interesting time to bring this next player in. I'm ready to give you a clue. Let's see if you can figure out who he is. He's been an undeniable top liner in his line before, for multiple seasons. He felt for a period of time a few years ago as one of the most bulletproof and reliable scorers going around. But for the last couple years, I would not use the words bulletproof or reliable to speak about him at all. And although there's a clear narrative and pathway that could see him back to that bulletproof, reliable, consistent scoring that he had for multiple years, there's also a world where he could be one of the greatest traps for coaches this preseason. Who are we talking about? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant.